right, welcome to this, the next in the Trinity P3 webinar, which is called Making Marketing Strategy Stick with Shawn Callahan from Anecdote. Welcome and thanks for joining us. Before we get into it, I just want to go through some housekeeping. So first of all, look, we're planning to take no more than now. We will be finishing at 1 p.m. standard time. You can ask questions at any time, and you can using the Q&A function, but you can also respond using the comments. So feel free to either comment. We've opened that up for all participants to be able to make comments, or you can ask questions using the Q&A. We're planning to have a Q&A session at the back end here. We're also recording this for future distribution and use. Now, look, obviously it goes without saying almost that the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the world. I mean, the fact that we're doing this webinar and we're practicing social distancing and social isolation is proof of that. The thing is that it's highly unlikely that we're going to return to business as it was soon. And so what we're hearing and seeing is that marketers are needing to pivot their marketing strategy to accommodate this new reality. But how do you communicate your strategy and how do you make it stick throughout your organization is one of the big challenges that many marketers and in fact many organizations face. So today we have Shawn Callahan from Anecdote. Now I've known Shawn for well, 2 decades, both professionally and personally. He's the founder of Anecdote. He's also the author of this award-winning book, and it's called Putting Stories to Work, Mastering Business Storytelling. And I can't think of anyone that could be more qualified and more experienced in actually sharing with us the role of storytelling. So welcome, Shawn.
Hey, it's great to be here, Darren.
Well, look, let's start off with the obvious question. You know, why storytelling? Because I think most people have quite an interesting view of storytelling, and especially in relation to strategy. Because, you know, when marketers talk about strategy, they talk about customer research, they talk about strategy workshops and developing a strategy document. So where does storytelling fit into this and why?
Yeah, well, I guess, you know, the first strategy story I did was probably about 10 years ago now. It was actually for TAC over in Geelong. And one of the things that I really got people interested in doing it is Janet Dorr, the CEO over there, was really of the view that, you know, you really can't act on a strategy unless it's in your head, right? So imagine, you know, and this is different to how we normally operate. People, you know, put all that effort doing their plan on a page or their strategy document, and someone says, "Oh, so what's the strategy?" And you go, "Oh, just one moment," and off you go, and you're having a bit of a look. Yes, they're the strategic choices we're making. But you'd be amazed at how many people don't have that in their head, right? I go from organization to organization and just ask them simply, okay, so what are the strategic choices you're making at the moment? And the senior executive down, a good proportion of those people could not put their finger on exactly what those strategic choices are. So I guess the first thing is about memory. The great thing about storytelling is it helps us remember these things. It helps us get it in our heads. Another good example of this is I remember running essentially a project for an insurance company, and I asked the CEO, you know, so why were they interested in using this story method? And he was saying that the previous time that they'd rolled out their strategy, you know, they did the big road show, you know, it was beautifully produced, and he traveled around the country, and it must have cost him a fortune to do this. And then he said about 4 months later, he happened to be sitting in on one of the divisions, his divisions, you know, essentially update meeting. And the head of the division was standing up on the stage, and she was just sort of saying, "Hey, look, we've just done our roadshow. Can you just give me some feedback? What's the key elements of the strategy?" And she had a couple hundred people in the room. And it was like, nothing. No one could actually sort of come up. And in the end, she sort of went, okay, no, I'm really, no, my direct reports. And she's down, trying to get a direct reports. And that's when the CEO was just shaking his head going, oh my God, we've just spent all that effort.
So Shawn, do you think it's the fact that so much work goes into developing a strategy, and there's even a Microsoft template for most of these strategies, where are we now? Where do we want to be? How do we get there?
Yeah.
That it doesn't actually ever transfer from being a written document, often held up as a shrine of strategy, into something that people can actually relate to and use.
Yeah, I think they think the finish line is creating the strategy. People fall over the finish line and going, oh God, we've got the strategy ready for the, strategic planning process that they have, which, has a series of milestones attached to it. But really, it doesn't, like Janet Dorr was saying, that very first strategy story, it doesn't mean anything unless it's in their head. Right.
But I just want to clarify something, because when often people talk about storytelling, they think of the sort of Hollywood style of storytelling. Are you talking about making a video or writing a book about your strategy, or is it more than that? What do you mean by storytelling?
Yeah, look, I got my interest in sort of early knowledge around storytelling was actually developed when I worked for IBM. And my job in IBM, one of the best jobs in the world, I had a job sort of like a corporate anthropologist. I would go into big organizations and I would collect stories of essentially leadership behavior, anything around culture actually. And what I discovered is that people in organizations tell small stories, right? And then you come out and people say things like, oh, we're going to craft a story. And they try to create these beautiful Hollywood, sort of inspired hero's journey type stories. But that's the opposite to how it actually works in organizations. So the sort of story I'm interested in is a small story, one where a leader actually can turn off the PowerPoint deck and sort of say, look, guys, I just want to fill you in on what our strategy is and particularly, most importantly, why we've chosen the strategic choices we've chosen. And then launch in and actually just tell it off the top of their head. Right?
So this is not about getting professional story writers, screenwriters or even copywriters, or advertising writers to actually come and make up a story. You're talking about actually developing or capturing stories that actually support the strategy.
Yeah, that's right. And you do have to craft the story for all your leaders to tell. But the interesting thing is that each version of it is different, right? In the sense that the nuances of the story will be different depending on who the leader is. Some will tell a version based on their experience, someone else will have another experience. So you'll get these slight variations of the story. But the backbone, the core of the story that explains, why you're actually choosing the things you're going to do is told by everyone, but it's told by them off the top of their head, no notes, in sort of oral storytelling.
Look, it's interesting because storytelling is very popular.
Yeah.
And in marketing especially, I doubt whether I could find a creative agency that doesn't say they're storytellers. And in fact, there's even a couple out there that say, don't be storytelling, be story doing. Do you find that people are confused often when you talk about storytelling within business and specifically storytelling for strategy?
Yeah, look, I think that what I discovered is that we use the word very colloquially, right? We're not precise in how we use the word. And the reality is you don't get the benefits of storytelling, remembering things, clarity, sort of meaning that comes with storytelling, unless you're actually telling a story, right? And a story has, at its very core, it's a sequence of events that have some, the related sequence of events, and something unanticipated happens, right? So that story I told you about the insurance company and his, the problem they had with, sort of anyone remembering the story. That's the unanticipated element of the story. Now, people in Hollywood, they've developed a whole range of techniques for doing this, you know, and Hero's Journey is very popular, and there's a whole range of different sort of tech, but that doesn't actually work that well in business. So what we need to do is we need to pare it down. We need to make it really basic, straightforward, so that any leader doesn't feel intimidated to do it. They go, oh yeah, I can do this. This is just recounting an experience, right?
Yeah.
So that's where we need to get to with these strategy stories.
Shawn, we've got a question from Scott Maxworthy. He says, how do you best reduce the impact of Chinese whispers? I'm assuming he means people gossiping as it's retold throughout the organisation. So how do you get people to align to the story?
Yeah. Well, it's funny that stories are more resilient than, say, if you were just to set out a series of facts or a series of opinions or perspectives. I did an interesting experiment at NAB. I used to teach storytelling at the NAB Academy, and I had a group of bankers, about 30 of them, and I got them in 2 lines. And on one line, I actually got them to do the Chinese whispers exercise, you know, where they had to pass a bit of information along the line to see whether it was different at the end. One line had a story and the other line had just some text from their website, right?
Right.
Well, the story got to the end and it was still recognizable as the same story, right? The text from the website, no recognition at all. You could not tell it came from the original source. In organizations, if you can get enough of your leaders involved in creating the story, then you have ownership. So the last big strategy story I did, I involved 100 of the top leaders to co-create the strategy story in one sitting. It was a couple of hours together. And because you've got such a large number involved in that, they all get on the same page for their strategy and their strategy story, and they also own it, right? And that's the most important bit. It's not just something that, say, the CMO has crafted all by themselves and went, voila, here it is. They've actually been part of the process. So that's a big part of it.
Let's get into that a bit more. So, you know, what is a strategy story? Can you give us a sense of, you know, what you need to have in a strategy story to make it a strategy story, I guess?
Yeah.
Well, you said it has to be customized for every organization, every situation.
Yeah. They all have their own strategy stories. Yeah. I mean, we use a very simple structure. Here's one here. This is Origin IT's strategy story from a few years back. But the structure is the same. You won't be able to see the detail per se, but that doesn't matter. I just want to give you a sense of, you know, how it hangs together. But, you know, it's in the past, it was like this, and then something happened. So now we're doing this. So the future can be like that.
Right.
So it's just got these basic 4 parts. And the 4 parts enable people to see the crux of what happened. What were the catalysts that changed the world so that it made sense for the organization to do this, this, and this, right?
Yeah, it's interesting that that's a transformation story, isn't it? Because most strategies are actually based around transforming a situation to advantage.
Look, I think it can be seen as a transformation story. It can be seen as, you know, it always involves change. Strategy equals change, right? Because whenever you come up with a new way of doing things, but the question that your employees will have in their head is why? Why are we outsourcing to Asia on this? Why are we shifting our emphasis from this product line to that product line? You know, why are we buying this company over here? And the best way to answer that is to sort of say, look, guys, you know, in the past, you know, we built up a really good capability around this area. But, you know, over time, you know, we hit a point where we just couldn't go any further. And then we had that situation where the revenues just plummeted because we sort of fell over a cliff in terms of what that product would deliver. So for that reason, we're investing to buy this company, which has got these capabilities. And in the future, this is how we see the company sort of running. And so it just helps people guide their way along so that when they hear it, they go, oh, I get it. You know, that makes perfect sense. And then when you get to the future, they're sort of going, they can see it pictured. It's not a future which is a series of dot points. This is a big mistake I see people make. They sort of go, oh, in the future, we're going to have collaboration and it's going to be integrity. And they list out all these things, and essentially you've lost the audience. You've got to keep in the story mode, right? And even talk about the future as a future story, or maybe multiple future stories. So okay, that's the crux of it, yeah.
So that's an interesting idea. When you talk about a strategy story, does it evolve or change over time?
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, for example, this insurance company I'm working with, this is the second strategy story I've done for them. And inside that strategy story, they want to go down different parts of their business, and they have their own versions of the strategy story, right? So you can have these evolutions or adaptions of the strategy story in different parts of your business, but it's still got the core elements to it, so that, you know, it still has those strategic choices, but they might have a slightly different way of articulating those things, right? So I think that's one of the nice flexibilities. I remember teaching a group of leaders to tell their strategy story in a big pharmaceutical company, and there was this ruckus going on in the middle of the group. There's probably 100 people there, and this lady puts her hand up and she's pointing at this guy next to her, you know, and not very happy, right? And so they gave her the microphone, or gave the guy next to her the microphone, and he sort of stood up and he had the strategy story, and he was sort of saying, well, I don't like this word, and I don't agree with this, and this is not, that's not right. And I was able to just sort of say to him, well, just tell it like you want to tell it. And you could see him going, what? So this is not a script? I said, no, it's not a script. It's the overarching story. It's just like if you heard a story in a pub and then you go and tell your version of it, most of it, like 90%, is exactly the same. All the crux of it is there. But you would modify bits because you'd forgotten bits, or you add bits that you like and expand on bits that you like, etc. So that's the real element of how stories are, you know, shared and told in organisations.
It sounds like this is a technique for actually implementing a strategy across a large group of people, across organisations, because yeah, what we've read often, I remember years ago, Harvard Business Review had an article where they interviewed or surveyed a large number of CEOs, and 62% said one of their biggest challenges was actually getting strategies to be successfully implemented. Right. But it was almost very easy to come up with a strategy. The really hard part was actually the implementation. Is that where you see a strategy story working best? Is it about the implementation?
I think that's a big part of it. Another part is just that whole level of employee engagement, right? So, for example, this insurance company, 12 months after they put their strategy story, they'd done their engagement survey. And for the area around strategy and trust in leadership and clarity of direction and all those sort of things, they'd actually seen the score go up 5 points. Now, 5 points in these surveys is an enormous jump, especially in a large organisation. And you know, you couldn't have had a happier group of marketing comms people, essentially, who were driving the process of crafting the story and getting it communicated in their organisation. So, you know, you have those sort of wins as well as the execution wins.
Shawn, we've got a couple more questions that have come up from Julian Barons. How do you think storytelling might change for a brand or marketing, given the challenging times we're going through?
Well, I think, you know, you have to be mindful of where we're at. It's like anything, it's the context, right? There's certain stories we've seen already, you know, sort of people just almost like jumping on a coronavirus bandwagon, right? You've seen this, Darren, haven't you? Sort of, you know, it's it's just
a number of emails from CEOs telling us how they're empathetic to our situation and they're here to help us and to keep their staff and customers safe and healthy.
Yeah, who would have known that we had that many friends from CEOs around the country? It's amazing. So I think in terms of storytelling, it'd be just being mindful of that sort of impact. And I think with stories, you really have to try them out. You have to, sort of go to the people who are actually going to respond to those stories and try them out and get that response. You never want to start off with a story and then the first time you try it is with a major brand in a major venue or a major event. You want to build up. You want to build that. It's a bit like how comedians build up their sets, right? They go out into small clubs. They tell the stories. They make notes about the story, what works, what didn't. They build that up until they're happy with it, and then they've got, their half an hour set or whatever it might be.
Look, there's another question here, Shawn. Thoughts on story structure and the brand as hero, protagonist, and leader importance. So in some ways, this is bringing up that whole concept around stories having, 3 acts, pivotal point, character transformational arcs, archetypes like the hero's journey, which you mentioned.
Yeah.
This is not really the type of storytelling you're talking about.
No.
This is the big story, the sort of Hollywood entertainment story. What makes a good story in this area of strategy story? What are the sort of key elements that or attributes do you need to actually tell or create a good story, strategy?
Yeah, look, I tell you, the biggest thing that has the biggest impact is having the individual leader share personal moments inside that story, right? So, for example, one that just pops into mind is, it was one of the strategic choices in this story was around, digitization of the organization. And in one of the tellings I heard of a leader sort of sharing that story, she stood up and she sort of said, we're all facing it, aren't we? Like, I was at the cafe this morning and I opened my wallet and I realized I had no cash, right? And it occurred to me, I haven't had cash in my wallet for, I don't know, probably 12 months. Everything now is just tap. And I would just bought my coffees, I tapped, and that's where the world's going. And we've got to be like that for our business. And so that little tiny experience, you could see the whole audience nodding and going, yeah, I haven't had cash either, And it was engaged, they were engaged with that person, right? Mm-hmm. So, and then another person will share a moment they've had in their career that, really changed how they saw the world, and that would be part of their story. Or there'll be a turning point in the big story, like, and then our share price dropped dramatically, and a leader will sort of say, actually, I remember that day. I was coming to see Jim, our CEO, and I walked into his room, and they just tell these little anecdotes of real life experience, which is a visual. And I think this is the key thing about them, is that when they're specific and they're small moments, they're actual visual. And it turns out the visual is one of our strongest senses. And we get drawn into that. We feel like they're there coming into the CEO's office. We're part of that conversation. So again, it's these small stories that make a big difference.
It's also relatability, isn't it? It's the ability for the listener to not only, I guess they visualize it because they can relate to it. It's of their experience.
Yeah,
whereas, I don't know about you, but if I'm watching a Hollywood movie, I don't very often relate to the character who has just defeated the forces of evil with their bare hands.
I totally relate to that. I mean, that's just...
Oh, right, okay. It's your secret super life. Well, look, I guess the other thing is that strategy stories are not just at the implementation stage, are they? One of the things you mentioned a moment ago is the fact that you can use stories or storytelling to actually clarify your strategy. How would you go about that? So you're working on your strategy, you're pivoting your marketing strategy
Yep.
to embrace everything that's happening at the moment.
Yep.
What would you do once you've got a framework of a strategy down there?
Yeah. Well, the simple thing I do is I get the people who are involved in crafting that strategy into a room. That could be a virtual room as well as a face-to-face room. I've just been doing a few virtual strategy story creation activities recently, as we all do at the moment. But get them into a room and just get them, sort of crafting, using that template that I showed you, that structure. Actually start to get them to, tell the story. Now, what happens, which is the interesting thing, is that someone will say, oh, look, the most important thing that happened was this thing that happened. And, the way I saw it happening was this. And then a person across the table go, oh, really? That's because that's not how I saw it happening. The way I see it happening was this and this and this. And so that's why we're doing that. And what's happening in that little cause and effect conversation that you're having is that they're doing sense making, right? They're making meaning out of the strategy, and then they're tweaking the strategy, but they're all getting on the same page, right? And it's a phenomenal, interesting thing to watch, because you just sort of see these people. And by the way, executives love it when you don't have to have post-it notes, right? There's no post-it notes involved in this process. They're just talking to each other, right? And they're writing things down. But the thing about it is that it evolves through that process. And I actually get them to almost like break into groups and then have story versus story, right? And see who has the best story, because
story battles.
It's a story battle, right? And they love it. You would think executives might be holding back a little bit, but once it takes them 2 seconds to get into it. They understand it straight away because it's a natural thing. And they love talking about their business and what happened and what they're going to do as a result of that and what will happen in the future when they nail it. So,
Shawn, I imagine this is done in groups of sort of cross-functional teams, across the C-suite. So you would have the CEO and the CFO and marketers and operations, the CO, all doing this. How do you think you get over the obstacles of things like, protecting their turf or only seeing the story from their particular silo?
Yeah, look, it's interesting because because they're in that multifunctional group, if you like. Mm-hmm. You tend, because they're one person representing just their area and they're telling this overarching story, it's very hard to actually take that perspective, right? It's just the nature of the storytelling process that it's very hard to sort of just be pushing your barrow. In fact, I've never even given an instruction around that, and I've never really seen that happen in all the strategy stories that I've created.
Look, and I'll explain why, because often marketing strategy is from within the organization out to the customers.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of company strategies are about the organization itself.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if a marketer's sitting there with a strategy story that is going to be, how we're dealing with and treating and recruiting our customers and building loyalty.
Right.
Is the organization going to be taking a perspective of, well, but we do this and we do this and you're asking us to shift or whatever?
Well, what I would be suggesting to the marketing department is that in crafting the story, they get people from outside the marketing department involved, right? So that those people who they are trying to influence and persuade with this strategy are actually partly owning the strategy story, right? And I think that would be a good way to move forward.
Well, I think you've answered a question here from Anton Bushner. He says, is the strategy story valuable to help leaders clarify their strategy, or is it best after the strategy is 100% agreed and then to tell that story through the organisation? You'd say the former.
Yeah, well, yeah, the former is the ideal, but both things happen. I've had situations where organisations have said, "Oh yeah, we have a strategy. We definitely have a strategy," and then I sort of say, "Okay, well, send it to me." Well, it's kind of not all in one spot. It's and that's fine. We know. Give me the 3 or 4 documents. Well, actually, we haven't quite written it down yet. And then when you discover that it's like a massive organisation. I mean, every company has a strategy in the sense that something's happening, right? Someone's making decisions. But in those situations where it's not articulated, the strategy story process is not a bad one to actually get a first cut of a strategy, right? So, but that's not my specialty, really. My specialty is really looking at the strategy is, there or mostly there. How are we going to communicate that and really getting it taken up in the organisation?
Shawn, have you got an example you could share where an organisation has aligned around a strategy story, where previously they may not have?
Yeah. Look, well, probably the best one is Allianz, right? So Allianz has had some really interesting, growth in the last number of years. But, some bumps as well. We had the Royal Commission, right, into the misconduct of banks and financial institutions. So it had quite a long name, something along those lines. But they moved, if you like, from a structure which was very much each division had the power, and the CEO was almost like someone, sort of like a figurehead that tried to hold it together, but the real power was in the divisions. And then over time, they moved into one where there was power from the top. And I was lucky enough to do a strategy story for the time when they were almost like bottom up versus the time that they were top down. And it was so interesting, the different ways in which they brought that together. But they've now gone from having a strategy story as a way of articulating their strategy, but it's now filtering down into other areas of their business, right, where they have almost like sub-strategy stories for different parts, and then right down to the front line. And I think this is a bit that gets forgotten, but it is vital. And I'm of the belief that that if you want to change a culture, you really have to change the stories that are being told. Your culture is totally representative of the stories told. And to do that, you have to tell, like, you've got a new strategy which is around, I don't know, let's say, let's just say customer experience, right? You're going to be totally customer focused. Well, you expect there should be lots of customer experience stories. You should be able to ask anyone and say, give me an example of a customer experience story. And they should be able to go, oh, just 2 weeks ago, and then they tell you this great little story.
Yeah.
So
that's
to
a
me
great
is the
segue, actually, to storytelling for the front line, because one of the things marketers are finding themselves is in a position of being required to develop and manage the customer experience. So it's great that you picked that as an area. That there is a overall company strategy, but what's the customer experience of that strategy? So, and then the big challenge is, as the marketing team in especially large organizations where marketing is perhaps seen as a function of the business, but they don't have authority over things like perhaps the retail or the call center or even the website where the customers are actually interacting. The organization. They're largely required or have authority around the communications, the way that the company talks and communicates out to the customer. But the actual experience itself is something that they're in a position of designing and then needing to influence the front line, the customer service line. So what you're saying here is that part of this is taking this strategic story to that front line. What are the issues around that? What are the things that people need to consider when they're doing that?
The biggest project we've ever done was with one of the big banks. And in 2018 with the Royal Commission, one of the things that came out of that is that they were not allowed to have financial incentives for the front line. And this bank, we were working with them on some other projects, came to us and said, we want to get rid of our explicit incentives and replace them with implicit incentives, a la storytelling. So we ended up training 1,800 branch managers, sort of all around Australia, on storytelling. Coming to your question, like what's important? Well, the most important thing is they need to be able to tell what's the difference between a story and a non-story, right? It's really basic stuff like that. And then you've got to give them a little process to do where customer experience stories are told every day. And the simple process that we gave these guys was they would have huddles, at the beginning of their shift and the end of shifts, and then they'd have an end of week sort of huddle, and they're literally standing up in the branch, and the idea is that the branch manager or anyone else just had to share one story of something that happened with the customer, and then the others would have a conversation about the story. And this is the important thing, where they ask questions like, so what's significant about that? And I go, well, you think about it, Janet would never have been able to do that unless she had the XYZ training. And someone else will jump in and go, yeah. And Bill, you're backing her up, right? So she can't do that unless you're back. And what they're doing out of that story, they're teaching themselves how to do great customer service, right? Well, this bank was worried that taking the incentives was going to reduce employee engagement, reduce revenue. Well, the exact opposite happened. It actually increased both of those things.
In fact, one of the companies that is particularly noted by a lot of people, Apple, and their retail customer service for being such a high quality. You've got a story about that, haven't you?
Yeah, well, I actually there's a couple of places that have done this very well. The Ritz-Carlton has done this very well, and Apple has done this well. And I've borrowed ideas from both of those. So the way Apple does it is actually around Net Promoter Score. So employees in their retail stores, customers are asked to provide a Net Promoter Score with different interactions they have. And then at the end of the week, the manager will do their, huddle. They'll talk, actually they're doing this every day, every day. Blue uniforms get together and they'll put up on a screen the Net Promoter Scores they got. And if anyone got a really high score, like a 10 out of 10 or whatever, they'll actually say to that person, oh, Darren, you got a 10 out of 10. Everyone claps. Why don't you tell everyone what happened? Of course, what do? You tell a story. You don't even know it's a story. You just describe, oh yeah, we had a guy coming in with his mini iPad, and what they're doing is every day they're filling themselves up with stories of great customer service. So they don't need inspirational posters or sort of the 3 key steps or anything like that. All they need is to hear the stories. It gives them permission. It gives them models of behavior. It's everything they need to know what to do in a specific point in time. So I think that's why I'm so excited about those frontline stories. You have to really make that connection. It's like taking a rope and making it taut between the executives and the front line. And you're doing that through those stories, because most of the time the rope is just wound up on the ground, right? And executives think of something and do something. The front line has no idea, right? But what you're trying to do is tighten up that rope so that there's a feeling between the two ends.
I remember quite a few years ago when it was called Safeway, part of Woolworths, was introducing the fresh food people. And the marketing strategy and the advertising strategy was to go out and communicate the fresh food people as a promise to the customers.
Yep.
And Trevor Hurd inside Safeway was caught up in an internal battle where people were saying, well, we should get the staff up to speed before we make this promise to customers. And he was saying, no, well, shouldn't we go with the promise and then bring the staff along? And I guess the way they did that before they even thought about storytelling was just sharing with the staff and getting the staff to share what being a fresh food person meant. So they actually went with the advertising campaign as, here is the lighthouse on the hill.
Yep.
Now, tell us, how can you live up to that promise that we've made to our customers?
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
one led the other.
Yeah, that's good. It's good. There's never one way of doing these things, isn't it? It's sort of, you have to come at from different directions.
Well, I also like this idea because it means that suddenly the marketing strategy can actually be implemented and throughout the organisation without actually having to have authority to tell people what to do. You're actually, engaging them and aligning them to a strategy through strategy storytelling.
Yeah, and there's another thing I reckon is happening too, Darren, and that is people are hearing this idea of a strategy story, and because it's got the word story in it, they quickly go to the chief marketing officer, right, and go, story, you know about stories, so that's what you guys do. And unless they have a broader perspective on what they could potentially do with it, you end up someone just writing a little story and saying, there's the story. It doesn't have the group process, doesn't have the frontline connection of small stories. There's a whole range of things you want to do. So I'm seeing some CMOs sort of stumbling because they don't really know what to do with that. Right? So.
Well, it could be a very different type of story to what you would do in advertising compared to what you would do.
That's what I mean. Yeah, absolutely. It's a different style.
There's also a role for, well, actually, I've got another question here. Drucker says that, it's from Nathan Hodges, Drucker says culture eats strategy for breakfast. Does the strategy story change that balance? Could strategy stories actually influence culture?
Well, I mean, there was a lovely quote by Gary Klein, who's a psychologist. He said that an insight is just a sort of discovering an unexpected story. It's sort of like, you're finding this news story and an unexpected news story. And I think that's what strategy is. It's a series of insights. Like we've had this insight, and an insight, as soon as you have an insight, it's going to change your organisation in some way. So the two are so interlinked. One is feeding the other. It's a bit hard to say which one has the upper hand. My preference is probably be thinking that culture does have that upper hand. There might be a slight balance resetting, but I don't know if it's going to be that much.
Or could it be that the story will only resonate if it's relating into the culture that it's being told?
Well, actually, yeah, it's a good point, because if you tell a story that's not related into that culture, it just gets spat out, faster than you could actually tell it. So that's why you have to use this group process for the story to emerge from the people in the organisation, as opposed to just being written by an outside person, for example. I once made the mistake of writing a strategy story for an organisation because they told me they didn't have time to sit down and go through the group process, right? And I stupidly went, oh yeah, I'll do that, And it was so funny, Darren. I had the executive team around the table. I walked in, I started telling my story. CEO came, like the last person in the room. About maybe 10 seconds into the story, he interrupts and says, Shawn, aren't all stories lies? You can imagine, it just spiraled into disarray after that. But
one of the things that often happens, even when you've launched a strategy, is that over time, it loses momentum. People sort of start taking it for granted. It opens a door for the naysayers and the cynics to start to undermine the strategy.
Yeah.
Where does strategy story or storytelling work in countering that?
Well, there's a concept, there's two things we should talk about there. One is the concept of anti-stories, right? So for every story an executive team tells, the organisation will tell anti-stories. right, to beat that story. And what you need to know is that you can't beat a story just with facts. You can only beat a story with a better story, right? So this is the big mistake I see organisations, stumbling over, because there'll be a story going out in the organisation. It's causing them the executive pain, and they'll try to beat it by saying, no, that's not the case. We're doing 3 key things, and they'll sort of get into dot pointy, perspectives, opinion language. You actually have to find a better story. So I think part of the strategy story process is actually helping leaders find and work to combat, if you like, some of those anti-stories in the organisation. But the other one, which is we've already touched on, but just to give it a little bit more, foundation in terms of the science behind it, those little stories that are told on a regular basis of the strategy actually happening. One of the things they've shown, Harvard business professor, a couple of Harvard business professors showed this in a book called The Progress Principle. They showed that if you can share stories of the progress that you're making, motivation just goes up, just stays up, right? And so people need to see the examples of the strategy actually happening. Then it's not just this thing on the wall, or as a document. It is actually, oh, yeah, that person over there was involved in that. Right? I think that's part of it. Makes it real.
Fantastic. Thanks, Shawn. Look, I think we've been getting some questions as we go along, but if there's any questions that anyone would like to ask, now's your time. So just use the Q&A function on the browser, and we'll answer those questions. Shawn, do you find that often people, you mentioned the CEO that thought aren't stories all lies or based on fiction?
Yeah.
Do you find that people generally are skeptical about storytelling, or do you think, because there's a lot of people talking about storytelling for business, isn't there?
Yeah. Well, when we started, 15 years ago, people were extremely skeptical of storytelling, right? You get hard to get anyone interested in it. Now, I think there's a general acceptance that it is an important thing to do, but they've been burnt by different attempts that they've made, which have taken an approach that hasn't really fit their culture, right? So, for example, scientific organisations, or like these insurance companies I work with, really numbers-driven, hard-nosed sort of guys. They don't want the hero's journey or someone with a talking stick come in and, they don't want any of that. They just want to know, okay, let's share some real-life experiences. They're very happy to do that. Right? One of the things I'd say to everyone who's online is that when you're listening to a story person talk, right, someone like myself who's sort of saying story is important, make sure they're telling stories, right? The number of times I've heard a so-called story expert give a presentation and they say things like, oh, stories have to have a beginning, middle and end, and stories are memorable and engaging, and they do, but no, don't tell any stories, right? You need to have your skepticism raised enormously at that point.
Okay. Thoughts about using live video for storytelling and the importance of media presence of the storyteller. That's from Scott again.
Yeah, well, I mean, when someone tells a story, it's not just the words coming out of their mouth, is it? It's their whole persona, their whole credibility, everything that they've done beforehand actually affects the story that they tell now. So, we might, if there was a leader who'd never told any stories or was really hard-nosed, you got to be gently get them into storytelling, to have that new. You don't want them jumping into a big story straight away. I mean, I had a chief financial officer who was this hard as nails guy, and they wanted him to soften up a little bit in terms of his communication, and you just couldn't take him too far too fast, right? Start with those smaller stories. I'm not too sure about. I don't do too much work with the medium. Darren's probably better placed to answer that question than me. But my sense is, it's the whole package, right? It's not just the story that you tell.
Well, I think, part of this is it depends on the audience as well.
Yeah.
I mean, part of the power of storytelling, as you say, is the actual storyteller, the person bringing it to life. The way that they communicate it. Does it feel like it's coming from them? Is it believable, or are they reading or memorized a script? Whether they do, and to perform on video is certainly more difficult for most people than it is either live, or some people struggle to to do that at all. You'd probably think that being a senior leader within an organization, they've probably developed some of those skills. But the second part of this that I think is really interesting is learning how to tell stories so that they become a contagion. A interesting word at this time, so that people start telling their own stories. They take these and don't just retell the story, but as you say, they then want to add to the story and start to tell about how that particular strategy story exists for them.
Yeah, that's right.
And that doesn't need video, because that's actually literally the same way as a virus passes, is from person to person, telling the stories that they tell in every day. It's incredibly powerful.
What I have in the back of my mind when I'm doing this is that the leader or the person in the organization telling the story is your channel. Right? That's the channel. And we know that people get the most important information directly from their first line manager, right? So that is the big conduit that we're trying to tap into in this technique. For me, it's trying to keep the story oral for as much as possible. I'm always worried, and I see it really diminishing very quickly, the impact that is, when people start to write down their stories. So keeping it visual, keeping it oral, keeping it on video and podcasts. What a great way of, sort of sharing oral stories is via podcasts.
So creating the pictures rather than just showing the pictures.
Yeah, sort of mentally creating those pictures.
Yeah.
It's so easy. I saw something the other day, Darren, I think you'll appreciate the ease at which humans conjure the story, right? From just the few words, like, if I said something like this to you, so the paramedic finished her text, love you. What does that immediately conjure?
Yeah.
It's a sad story, right?
Yeah.
And within seconds, we've just gone boom, 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 and there's all that story just there for us.
Well, it's part of the human mind that it likes to make sense of things.
Yeah. We hate having
storytelling has traditionally been the way we make sense and pass on the sense that we've made of the world.
Yeah,
so it's
absolutely.
Look, I think that's a terrific place to stop. I want to thank you very much, Shawn, for taking the time to share with us strategic stories and their application within organisations. So thank you very much.
Yeah, it was good.
Now we'll just look at what's coming up. We've got next Wednesday, Growing Your Independent Agencies in Challenging Times and Beyond. So please go online. It's trinityp3.com/business events. That's got all of the upcoming webinars. This Friday, actually, we've got one out of Singapore, which is Unlocking Performance Post-Lockdown, Creating Marketing Value with Less Budget. So that'll be this Friday. So 12 noon Singapore time is 2 p.m. for Sydney, or 12 noon for Perth. So anyone in Perth can join in at 12 o'clock, or if you're in Sydney, 2 p.m. or Singapore, 12 noon. And then we've got some more coming up later, mainly over in Europe and the UK. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. One other thing. We've made a recording of this workshop. It'll be available very soon. If you haven't already, please subscribe by going to trinityp3.com/subscribe. That means that you'll be receiving an updated on everything that we've been doing and that's coming up. So we'd appreciate, because that's probably the best way for us to stay in touch with you. And also, we have 12 one-hour customized strategy story sessions. But what we need you to do is to go to trinityp3.com again, /contact, and fill in your details, but also tell us what you want to achieve out of this session. So that'd be great if you could go to trinityp3.com /contact and just fill in the details, and we'll be in contact with the 12 where we think we'd have the most contribution to make. So,
and I'll throw in a copy of my book, Darren.
There you go. The book,
anyone who comes along,
stories to work, is also going to be included as well. So, and if you don't particularly in a position to use one of these customized strategy story sessions, please feel free to mention it to friends and colleagues that could. All right. So that's it for our webinar today. Really appreciate everyone joining in, and hope to see you either this Friday or the following Wednesday. Finally, thank you again, Shawn. Always good to chat.
Yeah, good to see you. See you, everyone.